again. Today's video is going to be just a short summary about the diaphragm. We're going to look at its structure and its importance and role in the body. So, the diaphragm is a double-domed, meaning that it has two domes, musculotendinous sheath. So that means that it's made of muscle and also has a tendon forming part of its structure. It is located in the inferiormost aspect of the rib cage, so it closes off the lower part of the thoracic cavity. And what it does is that it separates the thorax from the abdomen. So it makes sure that those two parts of the body are separate from each other so that the thoracic organs are only located in the thorax and the abdominal organs are only located in the abdomen. And the other main importance of the diaphragm is that it is responsible for breathing movements or changes in the thoracic diameters that are responsible for or assist in the process of breathing. Okay, so you can see in the picture how the diaphragm is sort of shaped like a parachute, and when we say double domed, we basically mean that it has two curved sides or two curved parts, and here you can clearly see that it closes off the lower part of the thorax. Now, in terms of where the diaphragm is attached, because being a muscle, that means that it has to be attached to certain places. In this picture here, you can see, like I said earlier, that it closes off the lower part of the thoracic cavity or the thorax. So part of it is actually attached at the back here with the vertebral column. Okay. Part of it is attached at the periphery with the ribs. And then you can see here that a part of it actually attaches to the costal margin as well. Okay. So the diaphragm has two sets of attachments based on where they are. We call them peripheral attachments and central attachment. Now the peripheral attachment is basically anything at the very ends. And these are the parts that are attached to the vertebral column. And the parts of the diaphragm that attach to the vertebral column are called the crura. Or crura is plural. If you want to talk about a single one, it's called a crus. It's also attached to costal cartilages 7 through to 10, meaning that it attaches to the costal margin as well. It attaches to the ribs 11 and 12, which remember are floating ribs. And it also attaches to the xiphoid process, which is the lowest part of the sternum. So basically it closes off the entire circumference or outer margin of the thorax. Now its central attachment, basically think of it like, girls, you're probably going to understand this a lot better than the boys will, but think of it when you're kind of like tying your hair in a ponytail or a bun. You kind of like gather all that hair in the middle and then you tie it. So that part in the middle where you tie it, that's the part that's called the central tendon in case of the diaphragm here. So all the fibers converge together in the middle and then they form a central tendon. And if you remember when we spoke about the pericardium, we said the pericardium fuses to the central tendon of the diaphragm. Now, the diaphragm, being a muscle, obviously has the capacity to move, and it moves in two directions. Now, the direction or movement of the diaphragm generally depends on if you're breathing in or breathing out. And this is probably going to be covered in more detail when you get the physiology of breathing and respiratory movements. But generally, there are what we call diameters of the thorax, okay, which are basically just the certain lengths that are found along the thoracic cavity. So you've got something called the vertical diameter, which is basically from the thoracic inlet up here all the way down to the thoracic outlet, which is down here. So it's the vertical diameter. Then you have something called the anteroposterior diameter, which is basically between the vertebral column and the sternum. And then you have something called the transverse diameter, which is between the ribs on either side, so the ribs on the right and the ribs on the left. Okay, now movement of certain parts of the thoracic cage will change each of these diameters. So, for example, when the ribs move, they're going to change the transverse diameter. If the sternum changes its position, it's going to change the anteroposterior diameter. And in this specific situation, movement or changes in the position of the diaphragm are going to change the vertical diameter. Okay, so when the diaphragm contracts, what it does is that it moves downwards. So it basically moves closer to the abdominal cavity. What this does is that it increases the vertical diameter, and then that's when you breathe in so that more air can be contained within the thoracic cavity. The opposite happens when you're breathing out. The diaphragm tends to move upwards, and what it does is that it reduces the vertical diameter, and then the air is pushed outwards. Now, being a sheet of muscle that separates the thorax and the abdomen, it needs to have what we call openings, because we're going to see that there are certain structures that are located in the thorax that actually need to pass into the abdomen. And so if the diaphragm is kind of sitting there closing off the space, then those structures are not going to have anywhere to go. And then the opposite is true, because sometimes you have things that are found in the abdomen that need to pass up to the thorax. So in order to transmit these structures, certain parts of the diaphragm are actually open, so they have little openings. And what they do is they allow the passage of these structures. Now the openings are 3 in number, and they are named according to the structures that they transmit. The other thing that you need to know is that each of these openings is found at a certain vertebral level, which again you guys need to memorize. So you need to know what passes through each opening and what vertebral level it's found at. So what you're looking at here is a view of the diaphragm, kind of like you're sitting in the abdomen. So you're sitting in the abdomen and you're looking at the lower surface or the inferior surface of the diaphragm. Okay, so here next to the vertebral column, you can see there's an opening, and this is called the aortic hiatus. What this one does is that it transmits the descending aorta as it passes from the thorax into the abdomen. Over here, you've got another opening, which is called the esophageal hiatus, and clearly that's going to transmit the esophagus. Again, that's passing from the thorax and into the abdomen in order to reach the stomach. The third opening is called the caval hiatus. That's actually kind of found a little bit in the central tendon. And this one transmits the inferior vena cava, which is passing in the opposite direction. It's going from the abdomen to the thorax. So since the diaphragm separates the thorax from the abdomen, structures passing between the two have to traverse the diaphragm. Accordingly, there are 3 openings in the diaphragm, which are the caval hiatus. That's the one that transmits the inferior vena cava. That's found at the level of the 8th thoracic vertebra. The esophageal hiatus, which is the one that transmits the esophagus, is found at the level of the 10th thoracic vertebra. And the aortic hiatus is found at the level of the 12th thoracic vertebra. Now, the openings are named according to the main structure that passes through them, but that doesn't mean that these are the only structures that pass through. So each of these openings actually has extra structures that pass through them, and we're going to go through those in an exercise as well. Okay, last thing we're going to look at really quickly is just the blood supply and nerve supply of the diaphragm. Now, in this top picture here, okay, again, we're in the abdomen, and we're looking at the inferior surface of the diaphragm. You can see the various openings. They're actually nice in this picture. Okay, now the diaphragmatic surfaces are two. You've got the lower or inferior surface, and you've got the upper surface, which is the one that's facing the thoracic cavity. Now, each of those is going to be supplied by a phrenic artery. So, like I said previously, anything related to the diaphragm is usually given the term phrenic. So, the arteries that supply the surfaces of the diaphragm are named according to their respective surfaces. So you can see here, this is the aorta, okay, and then this artery that's colored in green here so that you guys can just notice it, okay, is a branch of the abdominal aorta, and it's going to give branches that supply the entire lower surface of the diaphragm. That one's called the inferior phrenic artery. The one that supplies the other surface, which is the superior surface, is called the superior phrenic artery, and that's a branch from something called the musculophrenic artery. And I'm going to have you guys go find out where that artery comes from. Sorry. Now, in terms of nerve supply, again, we've got a nerve called the phrenic nerve, so anything with the term phrenic is related to the diaphragm. The phrenic nerve is a nerve that actually originates in the neck from the spinal segments C3, C4, and C5. And what it does is that it passes down the thorax on the side of the pericardium. So if you guys remember when we took the pericardium, I told you that one of the relations of that structure is the phrenic nerve. So it's going to pass down the side of the pericardium, and then it's going to end up supplying the diaphragm. Okay, so for that reason, because of the fact that it originates in the neck, cervical injuries are very dangerous because one wrong move or one serious injury could mean paralysis of the diaphragm, and that automatically means death. All right, so that wraps up the diaphragm. I hope that lecture was clear and useful for you, and keep an eye out for the exercises that I will have ready for you related to this topic, and I will see you guys next lecture.